Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. Matthew Fogg is a retired Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal with 32 years of public service and a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice. He's also known as the federal agent who challenged the blue wall of silence inside the U.S. Department of Justice and won. His District of Columbia federal court victory in 1998, which resulted in a jury award of $4 million for exposing race discrimination and retaliatory tactics by the Department of Justice, was a landmark civil rights judgment against the agency. Marshal Fogg has received major awards from the Director of the U.S. Marshals Service, the District of Columbia U.S. Attorney, and the Federal Bar Association for outstanding service above and beyond the call of duty, directing the arrest of over 300 of America's most wanted fugitives charged with murder, rape, child molestation, hate crimes, prison escape, terrorism, illegal drugs, and more in the U.S. and overseas. He supervised federal, state, and municipal police dragnets in major cities across America, clearing thousands of warrants and confiscating millions of dollars in proceeds from crimes. He was a team leader in the U.S. Marshal Service Special Operations Group, an elite SWAT team that assisted the Los Angeles Police Department in quelling riots in the wake of the Rodney King police beating. Marshal Fogg played a pivotal role in the extradition of Manuel Noriega from Panama to Miami, Florida on federal drug charges, ending the Atlanta Penitentiary hostage takeover, and participating as a first responder at the FBI Command Center in Washington, D.C. following the death of his Special Operations Group commander on Ruby Ridge in Idaho. He was honored by NASA as a first responder for rescue and recovery operations after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Centers on September 11, 2001. He co-chaired the No Fear Coalition, which was responsible for presenting the federal law known as the Notification and Federal Employees Anti-Discrimination and Retaliation Act. The law was signed by President George W. Bush in 2002. He is class agent in Fogg and Others versus Eric Holder / U.S. Department of Justice, which is pending before the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, representing hundreds of black U.S. Marshals nationwide. He often appears on CNN, NBC, CBS, Fox 5, C-SPAN, and syndicated radio as a special commentator and has been showcased in print news publications across the country. He is campaigning for public office in the state of Maryland and writing a book, Bigots with Badges, an in-depth look at racism in law enforcement and his battle with the Department of Justice. It's an honor to have you on the show, Marshal Fogg.
Thank you.
For those who aren't familiar with your landmark case, could you explain exactly how your civil rights were violated and provide examples of the racially hostile environment you worked in?
Well, pretty much I started in 1978 with the U.S. Marshals, and I had an experience when I was a young kid being arrested when I was actually the witness in the crime, and it was a strong-arm robbery. I was working at a Safeway store at the time. But anyway, to make a long story short, the police officer that came out and did the report took down my name and another store employee's names as witnesses. But by the time the report got downtown and went through its process and was turned over to investigators, they got our names mixed up as the suspects. Came out, arrested me, and they came and got me on a Saturday morning in Washington, D.C., where I lived at, and I ended up staying in jail until Monday afternoon by the time they realized it was a mistake made. It was a very traumatic experience, having gone through that process. But in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Marshals, we do things a little different from anywhere else in the United States because we're the Sheriff's Department as well. So we do the local stuff as well as the federal stuff. So everything that happened to me going through that local jail process, being arrested and charged and everything, and sitting on that bus, being put in the ride with those prisoners and everything, I'm going to be experiencing all of that when I become a U.S. Marshal. So you can see the effect it had on me once I became a Marshal. But the bottom line is, when I joined the Marshal Service in 1978, I remember coming out of the academy, after everything that we had learned, all the training we had, we were all hyped up, ready to go, learn all the proper ways to do things. And when I got to my duty station, the first thing the manager told me was, "Hey, Fogg, I know you guys learned all that stuff at the academy. You're all excited." He said, "But listen, let all that stuff go. This is how we do it here." And that's when I began to understand it was a sort of a culture of indifference, a culture, its own culture, hierarchy, if you want to call it, in place. And they made up the rules as they went along. And those rules happened to have a lot of biased applications when it came down to black versus white. I mean, it was very obvious. I mean, in the academy, I noticed a lot of targets at that time we were shooting at were black targets, were bad guys or black guys. But to get back out into the district and report to your duty station, actually begin to see these sort of racial sort of overtones, not only in the operations and who we went after and who we locked up and the bad guys, but even having to deal with it internally, seeing who got promoted and if you opened your mouth or you blew the whistle on anything, what could happen to your career. You begin to observe and you learn real fast, keep your mouth shut, go along to get along if you want to advance in your career, even if it's going to be slower than, say, your white counterpart. You go along with the program. So I happen to be one of those who didn't want to go with the program, sort of decided I was going to go against it. And we had a particular manager he was a chief deputy, like I ultimately became before I retired. That's what I am now, the Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal.
For the sake of clarity, what are the responsibilities of a U.S. Marshal?
U.S. Marshal's responsibility is to protect the federal judicial system. That's our responsibility. So we would be like a sheriff's department in a county, local county, or state. We're the same as that with the federal judicial system. We protect federal judges. We're asset seizure program. We got, of course, the witness protection program. And then we also have the fugitive manhunt program, and where we go after any fugitives, anybody that's has paperwork coming out of federal court. We have jurisdiction over that, as well as providing protection for the federal courts and federal judges. We got 96 districts around the United States, including Guam and Puerto Rico. So we had a particular manager. He was a chief deputy, and that chief is the person that usually runs the district. You have the head U.S. Marshal, who's a presidential appointed position, but under him is the chief deputy, and that's the guy that usually runs the district. And this particular individual, he was a white male, and his name was Ronald Hine, and he was known by other deputy marshals and folks to be sort of had racial bias tendencies. And the job-related word was just avoid him, but it's very difficult to avoid somebody with that type of management authority, because at some point you're going to run into him. Anyway, one day, and he was known also to destroy the careers of astute African Americans if he could get his hands on you or figure out some way to mar your career. And that's what he tried to do with me. I was on a high-profile assignment, worked my way up to it, America's Most Wanted. And one day he had me brought into the office and started just saying some bogus lies and things that supposedly some things that I had done on the assignment that I hadn't done, including taking a government vehicle home without authorization. Well, he went in and reported it to the marshal. The marshal didn't want to see me get hurt, so he just told this manager to go ahead and take me off the assignment and put me. I always say this, in every job there's a Siberia, someplace people don't particularly want to work.
A place where you're banished or exiled.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I got sent to Siberia, the marshal, which was the local superior court, where you're pretty much in court all day, standing around, you're handling prisoners, but you're not out in the street. You're not doing, real investigative work or nothing like that. So I filed a EEO complaint, and amazingly, one of the collateral duty assignments that I was given when I got on the Marshals Service is I got assigned to the EEO division. They sent me to the EEO school, so everything was perfect because I understood the process and I wasn't intimidated by it. And I knew exactly what to do if you were going to file it. And I had to actually help people with EEO complaints, so I knew the process. So this came on in 78. This incident happened in 1985. I filed an EEO complaint, laid out all of the things that this guy was doing and how he was affecting people's careers. And then I even went up on Capitol Hill and testified because they was trying to make this guy become a political appointed U.S. Marshal for D.C. Superior Court. I actually went up on the Hill and testified at that time was Senator John Glenn's committee. Testified for the committee, about 7 people. And I had listed all the things that this guy was doing to various African Americans on the job and complaints that they had against them. Didn't seem like that didn't really get their attention, but what did get their attention was the guy went to a retirement party at Bowling Air Force Base in front of probably 150, 200 people, and he stood up and he told a joke reference to coons, black folks. Bottom line to the joke was the guy, two black deputies were out raccoon hunting. They shoot a raccoon up in a tree. Raccoon doesn't fall out of the tree. They got a dog with them named Blue. Blue is trained to bite the genitals off a raccoon if he catches them. So one of the marshals was climbing up the tree to shake the raccoon out. That marshal slips and gets ready to fall back to the ground. He yells out to the other marshal, shoot Blue, shoot the dog, which is meaning the dog is going to think he's a coon. So he tells that joke. I explained that to the committee. That seemed to got their attention. They in turn, and this came out in court, in a deposition that Hines gave later on in my case, where he said they approached him about that, and he told them he didn't mean it in any type of racial manner, but their concern was, well, how come y'all not investigating Matthew Fogg's EEO complaints? One of the claims in my complaint was the marshals were delayed investigating these claims. In the meantime, they try to find some way to discredit you. So he said that they should be investigating. They'll find out that I'm not that way. But they said, well, look, we're not going to stop you, but we're going to hold up on your nomination until Fogg's case is investigated. He got angry and said, forget it. I'm going to just go ahead and withdraw my name, and I'll just retire. So that was the first giant I had slayed, Capitol Hill. So, and behind that incident, my name became, a target over the Marshals Service. So at that point, it was now, how do you fare with this stuff? And then one thing after the next began to happen. Other things began to occur, from promotions, not getting promoted when I got when I was a top on the cert list, being abandoned on Steakhouse. Just one thing the next was beginning to occur, and the complaints ended up going into federal court. In 1995, they fired me. They ended up firing me because what I did after they left me on a stakeout that nearly got me killed over in Baltimore. The white marshals abandoned me. When I reported it, they didn't want to do anything about it. Matter of fact, they ended up promoting these guys. And so I reported. So at that point, my doctor felt like I shouldn't be in that setting anymore because it was getting to be very dangerous. So I went out on workers' comp. I filed a workers' comp, and workers' comp accepted it because there were certain things that were proven that this manager, Mr. Hine, had done to me, that the agency did agree that he had violated my civil rights. But they felt like since he had retired, he was no longer a threat to me. But that's not how it works, because when you're in one of these command and control environments, you got a lot of friends and buddies, and so even though you may leave, other folks got to put a mark on your back. So you end up dealing with a culture and a systemic environment. So what happened was the retaliations followed me. I went out on stress on workers' comp, and then I ended up ultimately going into court in 1994. What brought me into court was the agency was trying to force me to come back in and take a fitness for duty exam. But when you're out on workers' comp, they're the ones who determine whether you be fit for duty. So the agency, because I wouldn't come back in, they then charged me with insubordination. And they used that charge to fire me while I was out on workers' comp. So while I'm on workers' comp, but workers' comp said, well, you can't fire him while he's on workers' comp. We're going to keep paying him. I got attorneys. We went into court, and in 1998, we went to a complete jury trial in U.S. District Court, Washington, D.C. The jury heard all the evidence and found that the Marshals Service had violated 13 out of 14 of my civil rights. The jury also found that the entire United States Marshals Service was a racial hostile environment for all African-American Deputy U.S. Marshals, and the jury awarded me $4 million, attorney's fees, and made me a Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal. To show you how the system works, because you see the U.S. Marshals protect the federal judges and all, so you get judges and you got everybody. You're fighting everybody. They have to protect the system. So we had a judge that didn't want to go along with the verdict. Now, Title VII is called Title VII case. Title VII verdicts are binding, but he's going to challenge it and say, well, let the appeals court tell me I'm wrong. But all of this was continued delays. So we got to go to appeal court appeals. Appeals court tells him he's wrong. I said, no, you can't. You got to go along with the jury verdict. Comes back down. Meantime, Then he ends up stepping down off the bench. Another judge takes it over, and then the government appeals it again. It took 10 years of appealing. 10 years. I mean, from 1990 to 2008 is when I finally got paid. And then when I got paid, they sicked the IRS on me. But that gives you an idea of the process. And at the same time, I filed a class action, which is currently I'm the class agent, with a lot of the marshals around the country are having similar issues that I was having, being attacked, internal affairs being turned on them, everything. So it's a systemic environment, and that's kind of what I'm writing about now. But there's so much information where over the years we've been saying the culture of indifference is just pervasive, and it's unchecked, and it's law enforcement, which means you can get killed, you can easily be set up. It's just so many things that can happen to you.
Over the last 2 years, news outlets have reported that police officials and officers in Alabama, Florida, and other states were fired for having ties to the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. This year, the FBI issued a warning that white supremacists were infiltrating law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Scott Shepard, a former national and international leader of the Ku Klux Klan, appeared on this show back in 2013 in an effort to warn the public that their presence extends far beyond state and local police departments. Tom Metzger, founder of the White Aryan Resistance, also known as WAR, confirmed this during his appearance on my show. Given everything you've experienced in this division of law enforcement, are you convinced they've infiltrated the U.S. Marshals Service? And if so, what would you cite as an example?
Of course. As a matter of fact, they got proof in my case. We've got a letter that, actually that letter would probably no longer would be sealed. But at the time, it was called the Roundup, the Good Old Boy Network Roundup, Tennessee Roundup. And this was like in right around 97. They had marshals that were attending these Tennessee Good Old Boy Redneck Roundups, where they actually had a black doll baby hanging from a tree, and the sign said nigger checkpoint orders. We had about 8 or 9 marshals that were attending those events. And
they weren't on stakeout, right?
They were members. They were attending and part of the organization. So the marshal had put out a notice and said, you will not attend these things. You won't be involved in this type of activity. But that told me right then and there. It's long-standing that law enforcement officials are members of these very subversive groups, Aryan Brotherhood, and some of these motorcycle gangs down in Florida, the Banditos and stuff like that, and some certain groups that clearly had homophobic views when it came down to people of color, African Americans and Hispanics and so forth. There's no doubt in my mind that they are members, and I would say that probably members of our organization that have some historical background with those groups.
What's extremely disturbing is the fact that officials and officers that were fired for having ties to the Klan and other groups went through background checks and psychological evaluations before they were hired. Hundreds more could be sworn in at the federal, state, and local level while we're conducting this interview. Do you think the screening process is so flawed that it'll become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to weed out members of these groups or track down the ones that have managed to infiltrate?
Well, when you're talking about flaws in the screening process, it's the same way when we look at whistleblowing deputy marshals or somebody blows a whistle. You got a good old boy network here. And a lot of these people get these jobs because of friends and buddies, people they know. So the system is flawed right there because you got nepotism, colonialism, and you got a lot of looking out. If you got that command and control sort of environment set up, you're always going to have people that are going to slip through the cracks. And I always say, and that's why the New York Post in 1997 covered the whole front page, Sunday morning edition, and they put the Marshals Service's badge in the middle, and they said bigots with badges. And that's in reference to my case, because a lot of the incidents that they investigated and came up with showed a lot of this racial bias, strong racial bias in the Marshals Service. And so what I'm saying is, when you've got a network where you allow law enforcement officers, people with such power, that's a lot of power, to be able to determine who they're going to hire and who they're going to fire and how to go about it, you can wind up with some shady characters once you look at their backgrounds or see some of the things that they've been involved in, but somehow they will slip through the cracks. I always say you have to have oversight on top of oversight in order to be able to catch these things. Same way you do with security operations for airlines and everything else. You have to always have watchdogs watching the watchdog.
Stuart Wexler, author of America's Secret Jihad, The Hidden History of Religious Terrorism in the United States, also appeared on this show and discussed an extremely dangerous underground network of white supremacists called the Christian Identity Movement.
Right.
Are you familiar with them, and do you know if they're on the FBI or US Marshal Service radar?
I've heard of them. I would think they would be on the FBI radar. Any group that has the, what you might say, is sort of extremist, I would think. And the FBI said there are thousands out there. So I would think they would be, but at what point do they put resources into really trying to see where they are and what they do, or whether or not one of their members might be join the Justice Department or some federal law enforcement group?
You're right, because how can an effective and proper investigation be conducted if you have members inside the investigative agencies?
Again, if somebody slips through the cracks and you don't know it, or somebody's got a buddy or friend that looks out for those type of people, you could be a sympathizer. You may not necessarily have to have been a member of the group, but you're just a sympathizer. So you make certain that people who think that way get in. So it's a lot of ways you can get around stuff. Maybe somebody may not have their name necessarily listed, but they are sympathizers and they believe that way. They were smart enough to know not to directly associate themselves with the particular group. But if you ever look at their historical activity within the rank and file, you begin to see a pattern and a practice. So that's the kind of problem that we're dealing with a lot of times in these situations. They're sympathizers. I always say a bigot with a badge, or, people say, well, it's just a few bad apples. I'm like, the problem is you just don't know which apple is pulling you over. You can't say it's just a few bad apples. Once you make this statement, it's a few bad apples, that's like saying it's just a few terrorists in the room. You got to have zero tolerance. And if you say that, that means your system is tainted. It is, what's the word I want to use?
Compromised.
Right, it's been compromised, exactly. Once you say that, that's why I've been saying a lot of this stuff that we've been hearing about. They say, well, you're throwing cops under the bus and all that. I said, no, we're not throwing any cops. I am one. I know our law enforcement. You're not throwing us under the bus. I said, we need to have oversight on top of oversight, because we become a command and control, sort of a monolithic power structure within ourselves. Before you know it, we're not serving and protecting you. You're serving and protecting us. And one extreme example of that is what I saw with the New York Police Department when they turned their back on their commander-in-chief. In hundreds and droves, they turned their back on the commander. I said, now, if that guy will turn his back on his commander-in-chief because he don't agree with him, imagine what he'll do with another officer he doesn't agree with, or a civilian. He going to turn his back on the commander-in-chief. You couldn't trust him past you could see him. But that shows you how powerful that culture has developed, and to where the point where they was really sending a message, we running this show. We don't work for you, you work for us. And that's what you always have to be concerned with law enforcement. That's one of the things that I wanted to bring out and show in my case, was that this is a monolithic power structure that is out of control. And the only reason why it's even being discussed now because of technology is the cameras. This stuff has been going on all along. I know many situations where, things have happened to people that shouldn't have in law enforcement, but you can get away with it because everybody's going to believe the cop. But now the videos is bringing stuff out. And law enforcement unions and stuff, they don't know how to deal with it, so their response is, oh, you're throwing us all under the bus. You know what I mean? That's the first thing they want to say. I said, no, we pay you to go out here and to do a job. So we're not going to pay you to go out there and kill people. Oftentimes they want to use the example, well, look at the numbers of blacks that are killing blacks in our inner cities. I said, that's a person who I don't pay them to kill one another. I pay you to kill somebody. It's a big difference there. We have a responsibility to make certain that you get it right.
You've battled racism within the U.S. Marshals Service, but you've also said the criminal justice system is another issue of major concern. What do you find to be the most disturbing aspect of the system, and what would you offer as a possible solution?
Well, again, the most disturbing aspect of the system to me is the amount of control, power and control that you have when you have a badge and a gun and you're there to represent the structure, and you make that judgment call on the street. That's a lot of power, and that power can get out of control, which is very easy. Like an example is they used to have a little saying on the street: if you run from the cops, you got an ass whooping coming. It doesn't matter whether you give up; they're gonna beat you down anyway. See, these are all the things that can happen. So to me, what the best solution in the world is, you have to give law enforcement officers, anybody that's willing to come forward and report other law enforcement, you have to give them whistleblower protection. United States attorneys and the DAs couldn't prosecute crimes without having witnesses. And you've got to have protection for those witnesses. Because a lot of them are coming forward knowing their lives could be threatened and dangerous. We have a witness protection program, U.S. Marshal, that does that specifically. Well, you definitely got to have that if you got a law enforcement officer go come forward and report other cops doing wrong. So that's the first thing. You have to have a mechanism out there that protects any law enforcement officer that's willing to report wrongdoing by others or the system. That's step number one. And you have to be able to have a vetting process that keeps it from being a good old boy network of people hiring their friends and buddies and getting folks through the system without being properly vetted. Those are the most important things you got to do, because it is a system that can very easily get out of control. Like any little small police department, so can the big ones. And when you look at the Justice Department, you look at what's going on over there. I'm writing a letter now. I'm pointing out all of these improprieties over the years that simply have just mushroomed. And they'll get people and they'll settle a complaint and they'll pay somebody off, but they don't admit or they don't bring anybody in accountable to the wrongdoing. So that the culture continues. It doesn't change.
In 2016, I'm going to do an episode on the escalating number of police killings of people who were known to suffer from dementia, schizophrenia, and other mental disorders. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if a person is off their meds, hallucinates, and sees the officers as gruesome monsters trying to hurt him or her, there's a strong possibility that they'll try to fend them off, which will be interpreted by the officers or marshals as resisting arrest and could result in the use of deadly force. Is that plausible?
Yes, that's plausible. If the officer doesn't know that the person has that condition, then the officer won't know. The officer just sees his actions as probably being resisting and so forth, and then will use. Now, the amount of force that's used is always questionable, because, that's a lot of discretion in that, how much force you use, and we're seeing that every day now that we got video cameras catching these things. We can see where, okay, that amount of force wasn't necessary. But if the officer gets on the stand, man, my partner got killed years ago, I saw this or this occurred, it's a lot of discretion in that whole process. And especially when you're killing people that are considered insignificant. Somebody that just is a nobody, as opposed to you going out there, you start killing middle-class America, you're going to get some drawback. So that's why you hear the term Black Lives Matter, because in a lot of ways, people of color, their lives just didn't really matter on a lot of arrests, a lot of scenarios, excessive force situations, drugs, whatever you want to use to say who were the easier targets, the low-hanging fruit. It was people of color or poor people who couldn't defend themselves.
As someone who hunted down the most dangerous of criminals, you're more qualified than most to talk about the importance of diffusing a situation through negotiation when possible. Was this standard procedure for U.S. Marshals when confronting felons that were known to have a history of mental illness?
Yes. We had training that specifically dealt with if you come into somebody who's known to have a mental illness or people who are reacting in a certain way, you try to diffuse the situation. That's what you try to do. That's why whenever you got a standoff, a hostage situation, they bring in what is called hostage negotiators, because these people are trained how to diffuse it and to try to ratchet it down before it gets really out of control. Well, even if you don't have that scenario, each one of us officers are trained to, in that training we go through, how to diffuse situations. Now, like I said again, knowing they are mentally ill or not, the problem is if they got a gun or they got a weapon in their hand, you have to react. You know, they say you use like force, you know, similar force to deal with force. But sometimes, again, we see, like the officer jumped out of the car and shoot the little kid, you know, in Cleveland. Or we see the officers choke the guy to death in New York City and he's saying, "I can't breathe." And people run around talking about, well, if he said he couldn't breathe, that meant he could breathe. I mean, you see, you got that type of mentality out there where instead of somebody saying, well, when he was saying he couldn't breathe, why didn't y'all kind of back off a little bit? Now, I was involved in a shooting where we had a guy. As a matter of fact, that morning I missed the assignment, and the guys went on, and they hit the door, and the guy shot through the door. Now, he was mentally ill. If I had been there, he would have shot me, because normally he shot through the door. It hit right where I would have been standing. But the problem was then everybody backed off, and then they had the police to come in. They ended up shooting this guy with rubber bullets and tasers and stuff and got him subdued and took him in. But he was a mental patient. So when we went to go get him, we knew that he was a mental patient, and we was going to take him to the mental institution. But, again, he shot through the door. So let's just say if guys had seen that gun, they might have started firing. It would have been no, let's wait. You know, he's firing us. We got to fire back at him. But when you got people that are resisting, a lot of times folks are not even really resisting. Let's look at the case up in New York where I think the guy was a tennis player.
Yes, James Blake.
They jumped and started beating this guy. A lot of times what happens is this. You get these jump out guys. And I used to work with New York and Philadelphia. And New York had one of the most vigilante sort of, I thought, ways, the way their police would do it than just about any department I work with. A lot of times these guys are, you know, of course they're in plain clothes. They jump out on people and they grabbing you before you even know they're cops. And so your automatic instinct is to resist or pull away. And that's all it takes. And then somebody's beating the heck out of you, saying you're resisting. And then on top of that, they charge you with assault on a police officer. So your life is documented now, and it's really messed up. So a lot of times that's what happens in these cases. These undercover cops, these people jump on folks without identifying who they are. Now, when you're a cop and you're in uniform, you tell somebody to step out of a vehicle or do something, even if we might consider it an unlawful order, you have to follow that order according to, you know, the law. And then later on it can be challenged as to why it was done and, you know, lawsuits and all that. Some people want to say to the cop, you know, well, why I got to step out the vehicle? You know, I know some cops, as soon as you say that the first time, they're going to go upside your jaw. They're going to jam you up, especially if they don't like you, especially if you're somebody that they had a problem with, but a stereotype or whatever. But you got somebody say, because I'm asking you this about the vehicle, sir, and then you might say it 2 or 3 times. They might work through that process before finally they physically grab you and snatch you out the vehicle. But this is all discretion. But now that we're getting it on videos, people will be able to see how many times the cop may have asked a person to step out of the vehicle or told them to do something. When technically, when you're in that line of work, you know, people are just supposed to obey your order, whether it's lawful or not.
None of the medical professionals or law enforcement representatives I contacted would touch this issue. So what options do caretakers or families have if no one is willing to address the problem? And I'm speaking specifically of cases where officers or marshals may have responded to a scene and the person was unarmed and ended up being the victim of deadly force.
Well, the recourse is they're going to turn and they're going to sue, but that doesn't bring the individual back to life. I mean, again, if you watch every one of these incidents, you go to any trials and you see what happens. Over time, officers, they get the attorneys, they present sort of theoretical scenarios, they present all kinds of thoughts that was going through the officer's mind, what he was thinking, whether he was thinking this stuff or not. Now you got time to say it all. And the bottom line is, if you got somebody that's mentally ill, it's two things. Does the officer know the person's mentally ill? Because there's their record. Now, remember there was an incident in Texas where the mother called the police. The young man was standing behind her, but he actually had a butter knife or something in his hand. And it was a screwdriver. And the officer was standing there, and then she said, well, look, y'all know my son. Y'all know what he's about, y'all. And she's called him before, and they kind of calmed him down and all. When she moved out the way, he had a screwdriver. When she saw that screwdriver, she said, oh, my God, no. And they said, put it down. And they're screaming. Next thing you know, they're shooting him. And he didn't get a chance to draw his hand back, throw the screwdriver, jump and launch at him. They shot him dead. Okay. But he did have a weapon. And your question was, even if you don't have a weapon. Normally, if they don't have a weapon or something, but they're not obeying a lawful command, if you know that they're mentally ill, then you have to go to the next step of force. That continuum of force, we call it, where you might decide, okay, well, I'm going to use a taser on this guy or something like that. Now, a taser could turn out to be deadly force because, it could stop your heart or something like that too. I mean, it's known to happen, but normally that's not what it does. You would think they might want to use some form of lesser lethal force than the ultimate of putting a round in you. Okay, but the bottom line is these are things that, again, it's discretion on the street, on the spot. We have to look at the numbers and we say, well, how many people are killed unarmed? And then we look at, well, then what are the race of these people? And we're seeing 10-to-1 people are killed unarmed, people of color. So then that tells you right off, there is some bias sort of internal process working here, that somebody sees a person of color as a threat. So you got all of this discretion, and you have to look at these incidents, and then you got to say, okay, is it the training? Because no, the training teaches us all these things. There's most law enforcement academies and training that I've seen, observed, training is good. It's just, what is the culture once I get out there and I get mixed into that culture? What is the mindset teaches me that I can get away with and that I can do? And it goes all the way back to, like I was telling you, when they say, Fogg, forget all that stuff. This is how we do it here. And you begin to mutate into whatever the culture is around you. And that's what they have to focus on. Has the culture changed from what was taught in the academy to what they're doing on the street? Has that changed? And if that has, that's why I said you have to have constant sort of vigilant sort of oversight, making certain that that culture hasn't changed, because it changes real fast after people get on that street a while.
Complete this sentence. I strongly feel that the future of law enforcement in America
will have to have continuous oversight. There has to be oversight on top of oversight, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that statement is all about people putting that badge, that gun on, and having that power. And if you don't have oversight and you're not watching it, I can bring any type of personal bias into that situation. And it has the ability to mess up a person's life with the stroke of a pen, a gun, or a baton. At any moment, you can change somebody's life.
Okay, you're placing a great deal of emphasis on oversight, but who should be charged with the task?
Government officials that actually are running the program, like, say, for instance, if the police department reports to the mayor, then it'll be his responsibility to make sure that that department has continuous vigilant oversight. Civilian review boards. I mean, it has to be a situation where it can't be left up to the law enforcement officer to determine whether they're right or wrong. It has to be somebody else, and that's what I mean by independent oversight. When I said, man, I should have said independent. Independent oversight to make certain that they're doing it right. You got your military people, but you got somebody that's overlooking that military that's a civilian person. And they may have had military background, but they're now reporting to Congress, and they know that certain things, if it gets out of control, they're going to be held accountable. So it has to be someplace where somebody can be spotlighted and held accountable, and make certain that structure does not become, again, a monolithic power structure, just like what happened in New York. The only one of them officers that turned their back on that commander-in-chief should have been disciplined. They should have been dealt with. Every one of them. And the union guy fired, whatever, said, no, you can't come in here creating a mutiny. You know, you can't do that. And once they turned it back and they asked them the second time, don't do it, and they did it, every one of them should have been, because like I said, for me, when you see something like that, that means it's out of control. Bottom line is, again, law enforcement officers do a great job. They have overall, we have a lot of responsibility. And when you look at the numbers of law enforcement officers, the thousands over the year, millions over the years, and you look at the numbers of officers that have been killed, it's a very minute number of officers that have lost their lives, even though the job can be dangerous at any moment, at any given time. But they do a great job. But to me, that doesn't matter. What the concern is, if you got a few bad apples, you have a situation that is unpredictable, and it would be just like me standing in a stadium full of 100,000 people, and I say, look, y'all, everybody in here is good, but we got two bad apples in here. We don't know what they're going to do. Probably most of the people are going to go home, because that's the impact that we have in law enforcement on the communities. So we have to make certain that we don't have any bad apples, that we got it right, that we have zero tolerance for any bad apples. And to me, that would be probably the sort of the mantra that we have to put on police departments, instead of trying to accept the fact that you're going to have bad police officers. That's like saying you're going to have terrorists, at the airport, on the job or in the government. No, you cannot say that. But overall, yes, the majority of police are good, but that doesn't matter if we don't know where the bad ones are.
Again, it's been an honor to have you on the show, Marshal Fogg. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm the G-Man. And until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.